Hello everyone and welcome to Investing by the Books, a podcast by Redeye. I'm your host, Eddie Palmgren, and with me here in the studio is my friend and colleague, Niklas. How are you?
I'm great. I've really been looking forward to our upcoming interview since I love to read about corporate scandals, and I was not disappointed by reading this book.
Neither was I. In today's episode of Investing by the Books, we have the great pleasure of speaking to Catherine S. Neal. Kathy has worked as an attorney and is since 2005 an associate professor of business ethics and business law at Northern Kentucky University. She is also the author of Taking Down the Lion, which we will discuss today. What is the book about?
The book covers the story of the big American conglomerate, Tyco International, and its longtime CEO, Dennis Kozlowski. In 2001, revenues amounted to $36 billion, and Businessweek ranked Tyco the number one performing company in the S&P 500. Kozlowski worked at Tyco for 27 years and held the helm of the company for about 10 years. And as CEO and chairman, he did hundreds of acquisitions and was greatly admired until he suddenly lost his job in 2002. Ultimately, he was convicted of grand larceny and other crimes that found him guilty of wrongfully taking $100 million from Tyco.
This is indeed a fascinating story with crucial lessons for both operators and investors. So how does the book fit with the quality rating here at Redeye?
So this book centers on the people aspects of a business, and as we will discuss, a company needs a competent management team, but also a strong board, and Tyco arguably lacked the latter, according to the author. The company also tried to grow by making larger and larger acquisitions, and having my serial acquirer hat on, that strategy seldom works.
Professor Neal was granted unprecedented access to Dennis Kozlowski, his papers, family, friends, attorneys, and former Tyco colleagues, as well as transcripts and evidence from 2 criminal trials. Taking Down the Lion was first published by Macmillan in 2014, and we are grateful to have its author on the show today. Here comes our conversation with Catherine S. Neal. So hello, Kathy, and welcome to Investing by the Books podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. Where are you today?
I am in Highland Heights, Kentucky, which is a small college town just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, Ohio. So I can see downtown Cincinnati from our business here, our business building on campus here.
And to begin, can you tell our listeners about your background and what led you into the world of business ethics and business law?
I sure can. I am an attorney by profession. I also have an undergraduate degree in business prior to going to law school. I worked in business at Procter & Gamble, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is the global headquarters of Procter & Gamble are here in Cincinnati. Worked there prior to going to law school. Went to law school, practiced business and corporate and tax law at a firm in downtown Cincinnati. And then I completely changed my life and went into academia. I did that, 20 years ago. So I was at the University of Cincinnati for a few years, and then I've been at Northern Kentucky University in the Hale College of Business since 2005. So getting to be a long time ago now.
And you're the author of the book Taking Down the Lion that we will discuss today. So in your own words, can you briefly introduce us to the story?
Sure. This is the only book, as far as I know, that has ever been published about the Tyco International corporate scandal that rolled out in 2002. This is a case that received a lot of media attention. I started teaching business ethics in 2005, the fall of 2005 here at NKU. And even in that first semester that I taught that class, I use a lot of case studies in there, just as it's just a great way for students to really critically think about the decisions that are made, ethical decisions that are made in business. And I've talked about the Tyco case since that fall of 2005, and that was actually the fall that Dennis Kozlowski, who was the CEO, who was wrapped up in this scandal, along with the CFO of Tyco, they were sentenced in September of 2005. So I've been talking about it since the beginning. The odd thing about this case was, and what drew my interest, is that there are many differences in this case from the other huge corporate scandals that happened in the United States about that same time. The Enron bankruptcy, WorldCom bankruptcy, there was a long list of scandals, Martha Stewart, Health South. But there was something about the Tyco case, even as I talked about it in class with my students, that I never felt I fully understood. I would try to explain it, and I heard myself every semester saying, I'm not really exactly sure what happened here, because there are some big differences than the other big scandals. A big one was that Tyco never declared bankruptcy. They were financially sound throughout the scandal and after. The crimes that were charged among the corporate leaders at Tyco were not crimes that were investigated and prosecuted by the United States government, which is the norm for these big scandals. It would have been the SEC, an SEC investigation, or U.S. attorneys. In this case, all of the criminal charges were brought by a local district attorney, which is highly unusual in a white-collar financial crime case of this size or of any size. So, that was a bit difficult for me to understand. And then looking at so many of these financial scandals involve financial statements that are wildly misleading to anyone who would use them for information. But in this case, that wasn't true. There was never any material restatements of the financial statements after the scandal broke. So it was those differences that really kind of drew me into the case, mostly because I didn't understand at all what was happening. Like I would try to explain it to my students so that they could understand, so that we could all learn something from the case. But it was very confusing to me.
And we will get deep into the details. But first, to put things a bit in perspective, how big was Tyco at its peak? And can you compare the company in terms of size and influence to a company today?
I can. When Dennis Kozlowski started working at Tyco, he started there in 1971, and it was a relatively small company based in New Hampshire with annual revenue of about $20 million. By 2001, which was the last year before the scandal, their annual revenue was $40 billion. They were at that time one of the 50 largest companies in the world by market cap, I think, and annual revenue. They were making $150 million a day in sales. So they were quite substantial. If I think about companies now, adjusting for the 20 years since this happened, this would be on the level size-wise of annual revenue of a company like P&G or Intel or MetLife, even Walt Disney, so really large companies. Interestingly, though, Tyco has never really been a household name. Even at its peak, I don't think that most people knew Tyco like all of the other big companies at that time. Tyco was a conglomerate of a lot of really not glamorous businesses. There wasn't anything very specifically interesting to most people. Pipes and valves, electronics, medical devices, things like that. The big brand that most people would have heard of was ADT Security, which in the United States is a common. Lots of the homes and businesses have ADT Security signs on their property. That's a well-known brand here, and Tyco acquired ADT Security at one point. But for the most part, most people did not know the name of Tyco very well.
In the book, you compare them at some points with General Electric.
Yes, and not just me. There were many people at the time who were watching what Tyco was doing and thought that they were modeling the company after GE, the types of acquisitions that they made, the types of businesses that they became interested in. So yeah, that was a common comparison at the time.
And as mentioned, Dennis Kozlowski is the lion in the book title and the main character of the story. Can you tell us a bit more about him?
I can. He is an incredibly interesting person, as you might imagine. Someone who reaches the heights in his career that he did, and then the lows as well. He grew up very modestly in New Jersey, probably what would be considered a lower middle class family, did not come from wealth, started working at a very young age, and worked all through school, paid his own way through college. And everyone I talked to about him always described him as the hardest working person they knew. Yeah, so he's a very hardworking, ambitious, very smart person who, once he got into his career at Tyco, was known for an aggressive growth mentality. He really just focused on growing the company. And that took him he started at Tyco as an internal auditor, so a low-level position, and through his own work and success in the company, progressed all the way to CEO.
We'll talk more about him and what we can learn from how he acted in the company. But we're also curious to know a bit more about how it was when you wrote the book. Why did you do it, and how was it to write it?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was just confused and curious about what really happened in this scandal. And looking back, what was a completely random act on my part. And I'm sure I was sitting in my office. I'm sure I had a long list of work to do, but instead of doing the work, I was thinking about this case and wondering how I could better understand it, where I could get more information. And I thought, Dennis Kozlowski, he would know. He would know the most. And I knew he was still in prison at that time. This was in 2011, so 12 years ago, about this time of year. So I looked online to see which prison he was housed in New York State, and got an address. And I wrote a brief letter explaining who I was and asking if he would be willing to answer some questions for me, just so I could better understand the case, the company, his role, so that I could explain it in my classes. So I sent this letter and honestly didn't think much else about it. I didn't invest much time in it and sent it out. And a few weeks later, I walked into my department office and the administrative assistant said, hey, you've got a letter from a prison in your mailbox. and it was a handwritten one-page letter from him saying he would be happy to answer any questions that I had about the company, and that he would have to do it just through handwritten letters because that's all he had access to. in prison. And so that started a series of me sending him questions and him sending handwritten responses to me, just answering my questions about what happened. Of course, that was a lot for him to have to write out a whole history of the company with just to handwrite it. So at some point, months into that, and it was a lengthy process as correspondence goes in and out of a prison. It takes a long time because they read everything going in and they read everything going out, and so it was a lengthy process. So months into this, he suggested that if I would be willing to travel, we could cover a lot more ground if we met in person. So, of course, in my position as a professor, it's just a really rare opportunity when you would get to meet someone that you've talked about in class for years and have access to them. So I said, yes, of course. And even though I'm an attorney, I have never been anywhere near a jail or a prison of any kind. So it was that the experience of going into a maximum security prison was something. And so I did go, and I was able to meet with him on visitors' days, which I believe were 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., where we would just sit at a table in a visitor's room, and I could ask him questions, and he would and answer my questions. The difficult part of that arrangement was I wasn't allowed to take in any notes or pen or paper or anything to write anything down. So I had to try to remember, and you could imagine 7 hours of uninterrupted conversation. You can cover a lot of material. So as soon as I would get to my car, I had a little digital recorder, and I would try to recall everything that we talked about for 7 hours. But I then started really understanding the case, and as it rolled out, it was just so very different than everything I had ever read about the case, even things that are in textbooks in the field of business ethics. The information in those textbooks was just completely different than the things he was telling me. Those conversations, ultimately, it was Dennis who suggested or asked if I might be interested in writing a book, because he had been approached by people prior to me talking to him about a book, but he had become distrustful. Most of those people, maybe all of them, were from the media, journalists of some type. And he had become very distrustful of journalists. If you've read any of the coverage of him in the case, you could understand why he might not be interested in a journalist or cooperating with a journalist to write this story. So, so we talked about that, and I said, yeah, I might be interested. My whole objective with the book was for it to be accurate. That was the whole point for me was to produce the accurate telling of what happened in this scandal. I was fortunate that he did give me access to his attorneys, and he had a lot of attorneys over those years who had corporate documents from those years. And when I say corporate documents, I mean tens of thousands of corporate documents, and the transcripts and evidence from 2 lengthy criminal trials. So those were things that, not to say that I distrusted what he was telling me, but of course I wanted to be able to have other sources of information as I put the book together. And it was incredibly helpful, but it also incredibly time consuming to sift through, thousands of corporate documents to make sure, so I could see what really happened. But that's where the story got really interesting for me, because, I could read reporting in what I had always considered to be highly reliable, respected sources in the media about this case. And then I would be looking at documents and evidence in a trial that completely contradict the things in those articles. And that was, unexpected for me.
It must have been a very special situation being this business ethics professor and even in law, and then on the other hand have such a close contact with him, the convicted person.
Yeah, it was an interesting opportunity to talk about someone. We, all of us and who do what I do, you talk about different people in classes, but you don't really know those people. You don't really ever get a chance to interact with those people. So it was a great opportunity for me, and then ultimately my students who get kind of a firsthand view also.
But it must be easy to get emotional in this kind of, and very engaged in this kind of story, I can imagine. How did you stay objective besides reading all those documents?
Well, yeah, that was fortunately, he never pressured me to twist the story or to, in fact, he never saw anything that was written until it had already gone to the publisher. So he didn't have any influence over what I wrote or how I wrote it or how my opinion about it. As I said, my main goal was to be accurate. That was, and that I know looking at the book, even now, as I go back and look at it, I write like a lawyer. I write like an attorney. I footnote everything. I was incredibly conscientious about being accurate. I know he's very controversial. I know that if I didn't have sources for what I included in the book, that it would be criticized or even criticized by myself. So, I really never felt that really wasn't too difficult. Because again, my goal throughout was to be accurate. My editor, she kept, she was like, "You don't want all these footnotes," and it's like, "But I do, I do want all the footnotes because that's what I'm doing. I'm telling this story from the facts, from the sources, the documents that exist. So that's why there are hundreds and hundreds of footnotes in the book at the back of the book."
I mean, I found it really interesting to read about all the events. I mean, from Dennis Kozlowski and Mark Schwartz, the CFO, being convicted of this crime, and about, I mean, why they were convicted. Maybe you can give us some more background on that. What actually happened, and I mean, how were the proceedings with them getting sentenced, and how long were they in prison, and so on.
Most significant crimes that they were charged with were grand larceny. That was stealing from the company. And that theft, what the prosecutor said, was in the form of 4 very large bonuses. And here's what's interesting. Those bonuses were paid based on a written pay for performance compensation plan. It wasn't just some numbers that were pulled out of the air. There was a written compensation plan, which, by the way, was in place prior to Dennis Kozlowski becoming CEO. So it's not a compensation policy that he came up with or suggested, or it was already there. The big difference was the company had grown so significantly. So what used to be relatively small bonuses based on the mathematical calculation included in that compensation plan, you start adding several zeros after those numbers, and those become what many people, including myself, would consider ridiculously large bonuses. And that's, one of my biggest criticisms here was a lack of oversight by everyone. I mean, that, at some point, that policy should have been reviewed to see if it's still made sense for the company. Is that reasonable? Is that, but it just never was. So there are these 4 huge bonuses based on the profitability of 4 huge transactions. And it wasn't just Kozlowski and Schwartz who got bonuses. There were other people involved in those transactions who received bonuses at the same time. Of course, they weren't as large as Kozlowski and Schwartz bonuses, but so they got these 4 big bonuses. The problem was when there was no clear record keeping in whether the board knew about the bonuses, when they knew about the bonuses, were the bonuses paid at the right time? It was done. They were done in a undocumented manner, even though, and I checked this myself, the mathematical calculation of the amounts was correct according to the compensation policy. But the questions then started coming up. Well, did they get them too early, or did the board? There were 2 criminal trials. For Kozlowski and Schwartz were tried together. The first criminal trial lasted 6 months. It was declared a mistrial while the jury was deliberating. So there was a second trial that lasted 5 months, and it was at the conclusion of that trial that they were both convicted. During those trials, the directors, some of the directors from Tyco testified that either they didn't recall if they knew about those bonus payments, or that they testified that they weren't told about them. Now, there is even a question in my mind. There was nothing in the compensation policy that required board approval before those payments were made. I don't, so I'm not even sure why the focus was kind of on whether the board approved them, because if they had not paid them, then they're in violation of, their own compensation policies. Okay, so they paid the bonuses, but Tyco, not unlike other large corporations like a GE or other corporations at the time, used to regularly loan money to their key executives, key employees. They'd have loan programs, and Tyco had a couple of loan programs. Tyco had what was called a key employee loan program, where they would loan, again, huge amounts of money to key employees to prevent them from selling Tyco stock that was vested when taxes were due on that stock. So they wanted to encourage these key folks to hang on to their Tyco stock. So instead of them selling the stock to take care of the tax bill, they'd say, don't do that. We'll loan you $20 million instead, and you can pay your taxes. So all of these, including Kozlowski and Schwartz, had these huge loans due to Tyco. So for the bonuses, some of them weren't paid just as, a cash bonus to Kozlowski or Schwartz. They were used to pay off the loan that they owed the company. Mistakenly, they often refer to this as loan forgiveness. Well, it wasn't really forgiveness because they earned the bonus and then they used it to pay off the loan, but they called it loan forgiveness. And when that starts getting reported, it's reported as, well, they're borrowing money and then the company's forgiving it, and these were huge, $25 million, $30 million, so it was a lot of money flying around, and it was done haphazardly. That was the, if I had to point to the number one problem, it was for a huge corporation. They ran it like a mom and pop shop, very informally, didn't recognize corporate formalities, didn't keep good records, which, ended up coming back to hurt, several of those people very much.
Charlie Munger, one of our idols, has said that the world is not driven by greed, but by envy. And I think you described one incident in depth where the company paid one of the board members a large fee for having helped matchmaking a large acquisition. And the other board members got upset, driven by this envy. So can you please tell us this story?
Yes. We spoke earlier about how it looked like Tyco was modeling itself after a GE. And one thing that GE had at the time was GE Capital. So they had their own financial arm of the company. So Tyco decided they wanted to acquire a financial arm as well. So they did. And that the initial conversations between that company and Tyco were facilitated by one of the Tyco board members. And quite honestly, it wasn't like he invested a lot of time or work, but it was his relationships that facilitated that acquisition ultimately. And Kozlowski agreed to give him a $20 million finder's fee. Now, if you go back and look, and this is a big problem, almost every member of the board of directors of Tyco over those years had some type of additional relationship with the company. They were leasing jets to the company. They were buying assets or selling assets to the company. So this certainly wasn't the only board member who was receiving additional compensation over and above board fees, but it was the amount. And you're exactly right. It wasn't that they thought that was wrong. It was, where's mine? Why is he getting $20 million and where's my $20 million? So you're right. That's exactly what it was. And that set off this huge string of events, the anger. Well, the company had run very smoothly for 10 years. Kozlowski was CEO for 10 years. Everyone was happy. Investors were happy. Employees were happy. The board was happy. So and the longer that everyone was pleased with the performance, the less hands-on everyone was. The board just gave Kozlowski freedom to do whatever he wanted with little or no oversight. They're all making money from their board fees, but more importantly, from the other relationships they have with the company. Then in 2001, there was a recession in the United States. So it was the first time really that they had benefited from the boom market of the 90s. So, it was the first time that the stock price dropped a little. Then we had the terrorist attacks in September of 2001 and the market crashed. And that was the first time that the board started questioning Kozlowski at all, started expressing any unhappiness. And then this big finder's fees to one of the directors really set them off. They were already getting pressure and feeling unhappy. And then when they found out about that, then it set off this whole thing. Then this is just a series of unfortunate events if you look at it from Kozlowski's perspective. Then in June of 2002, so this is following up, they're already unhappy with the $20 million payment. They're trying to get him to pay it back. He's refusing to pay it back. Kozlowski is charged with sales tax evasion, completely unrelated to Tyco. This is a personal purchase of art through a art dealer. And there just happened to be at that time in Manhattan, in New York City, the district attorney was cracking down on individuals, wealthy individuals, who were buying expensive things outside of the city and transporting them into the city. Those things are subject to an 8% use tax in New York City. So that, that's a lot of revenue for the city. So, and so Kozlowski's art purchase got caught up in that, just, unrelated and coincidentally. And ultimately, those charges were dropped because, in fact, there's not even a crime to charge him with. The crime is the dealer supposed to collect that, not the customer. But the damage was already done because the minute he reported to the board that he was being charged with the sales tax evasion charges, the board fired him immediately over the phone. They didn't even meet with him, fired him over the phone. And I fully believe, if that had happened a year earlier, they would not have fired him. They would have let it play out. They would have seen, wait and see what happens. It's unrelated to his leadership of Tyco, but they were already unhappy. So it was the perfect excuse for them to fire him. Now, here's where something really odd came into play. A year earlier, beginning of 2001, the Tyco board became concerned because Dennis Kozlowski had never signed an employment contract with Tyco. He was at will. He could go whenever. And he was being recruited by a number of companies, aggressively so. He had achieved great success. Tyco had grown exponentially. Under his leadership as CEO, they had 40 consecutive quarters where they exceeded earnings goals. So, so he's racking up quite an attractive record for himself. So in order to provide assurances to Tyco shareholders, they wanted him to sign an employment contract, just an assurance that he's going to stay on. So in 2001, early 2001, he signed what they called a retention agreement that, again, has a mathematical calculation of, if you stay 8 more years, here's the amount we'll pay you at the end of it. And it would be based on his highest year of earnings. That's what you plug into this calculation. And at that point, his highest year of earnings, I think, had been about $150 million, his compensation. So his highest year of compensation. So based on that, what was already his largest year of compensation, that payout was going to be just under $500 million. So it was this huge, payout at the end of the term. In addition, if they fired him before the end of that term, let's say, 3 years into it, they decided they didn't want him to continue, they still had to pay him out, the big golden parachute. So almost $500 million. In that agreement, and again, I have the agreement, I've read the agreement. The only reason that they didn't have to pay him that huge amount of money was if he was fired for cause, and for cause was very narrowly defined as he was convicted of a felony that was injurious to the company. So they fired him because of these sales tax charges, which are not related to the company and were ultimately dropped. So then this became an issue of compensation. He believed that he was due that compensation, and the board did not want to pay him that compensation. And that's where everything just kind of exploded. They brought in an independent investigator in a very short amount of time, fed evidence to the Manhattan District Attorney, and they were charged with these serious felonies. It was just a convergence of really bad timing. They're unhappy. They were really unhappy about that $20 million payment. Company's not doing particularly well. The acquisition of that financial arm of the company was failing. They were going to have to get rid of that. Economy's doing poorly. So that it was just, and then you've got Enron, WorldCom, all the other big scandals that are rolling out here in the United States at the time. And it was a really good time to hate corporate executives, especially highly paid corporate executives. And for an elected prosecutor like the Manhattan District Attorney, it certainly would be attractive to prosecute some of these people who were at the time not well liked at all. So it was just really really bad timing. And this is where, we talked about, the poor record keeping and the failure to observe corporate formalities and lack of oversight by the board. That's where this really came back to hurt Kozlowski and Schwartz, and the general counsel was also charged. When you don't have clear records of what happened and who did what and what was approved and wasn't approved and no oversight, that's where that became a huge problem, because when Kozlowski and Schwartz needed those records, they did not exist.
And speaking about those records, you described Dennis as this workaholic. He was super focused on the big picture, and he was a visionary, but also terrible at the everyday tasks. And in the book, you write that his electricity was turned off because he didn't take the time to pay his bill, for example, and that led to a person in the Tyco treasury taking care of all his personal finances. And then when he suddenly got fired, as you mentioned, he even had to call this person to ask for his social security number. I find that fascinating for one of the biggest companies.
Correct. I also, that was one of the most interesting just things about him personally. Well, he and I have had this conversation, because as I found out that this happened, like, what were you thinking? That's, for someone who is incredibly talented and smart, to allow someone in the company to manage all of your personal finances. It's like, why? You were making $150 million a year. Hire yourself a wealth manager, hire someone outside the company, and in fact, the people in this, they created this, what they called the Executive Treasury Department. They created it for this purpose. There were 3 people who worked there. So 3 Tyco employees who managed the personal finances of the CEO and CFO. According to Kozlowski, this was Mark Schwartz, the CFO's idea. It was his idea. I'm not sure how it came about, but and honestly, these 3 employees had no background in managing wealth, certainly not even managing normal finances, so it's like, why would you even want someone in the company to know all your personal business? Like, I can't even imagine. In talking about, I talked about earlier, how some of the bonuses were used to pay off loans. This is part of the problem. So the way that this was handled, I've seen the documents, and these are literally handwritten ledgers of paying their personal bills, So here's what would happen. Let's say that Kozlowski was due some big chunk of stock vests, and he owes taxes on them on a certain date. And the policy of the company was you could borrow up to 50% of the value of the stock that was vesting. So let's say $50 million of stock is vesting on a particular date. You could borrow $25 million, 0 interest from the company. The way that would happen in practice was the people in this Executive Treasury Department would prepare a promissory note for $25 million, an IOU, basically, and stamp Kozlowski's signature on it. That was the documentation for this. But the way that they did this, it's not like they took the $25 million and wired it into some account somewhere, or, instead they used it like a revolving line of credit. So they would be like, okay, Dennis has $25 million. Then all of his personal bills and expenses would run through that. So if he wanted to buy jewelry for his daughters, he would have the jeweler send the bill to Tyco, and Tyco would pay that amount, whatever it was. If he bought a boat, the marina would send the bill to Tyco, and Tyco would pay that amount. Anything from $300 to mow his lawn to a $16 million yacht would run through that account. Now, when you look at it, the reality is he always paid back the full amount of the loan. So he borrowed $25 million and he paid back $25 million within the time frame that it was required. But when you look at it, it looks like Tyco's paying his personal expenses. Now, from an ethics point of view, you also have to ask the question, like, are you being a good steward of company assets? Is this really the way that Tyco assets should be used? Now, you could ask Dennis Kozlowski and he would say, we wanted to free ourselves up to grow this company. And we were very successfully. So this is a small expense, a small perk for us so that we can focus on the next acquisition or, travel whenever we need to travel. And we don't have to worry about these little details of daily life. That would be his, and I will say, you can go back and look at other corporate executives at the time. Jack Welch is one of them at GE, who had similar perks, and it just, I don't know if it was just the time we thought that was acceptable then. But it was just a really, really, really bad idea. And I can't imagine, I just put myself in that situation. Well, number one, I can't imagine making $150 million a year. But if I did, I can't imagine wanting someone in the company managing that for me or having access to everything I buy or want to do. I think it was just such an odd decision for him. But again, he did not like to deal with those things in his life. He wanted to delegate that, and he did. That he did, and it came back to hurt him severely.
He must have felt that this was his company and his family, and he could never imagine that something like this would happen. That he would be.
That is correct. You're exactly right. I think one of the biggest issues here is. He did think of this as his company. He really, and I don't mean that in a negative way, in that he was trying to take things or, he really invested his whole life in this company, in growing this company, in nurturing this company. But he never drew the line with which you must do when it is a publicly traded corporation. The investors did benefit from his dedication. However, he had duties that he just didn't like to observe because, he did think of it as his company. I think in his mind, there was no separation between him and the company. Something in his name could be in the company's name, or something in the company's name could be in his name. And it was all the same to him,
And we spoke about Kozlowski as the CEO, and then we talked about the board, but he was actually the chairman of the company as well.
That is correct.
Which is not the case in Sweden, where we are based. This would not happen. But in the US, it was quite common then, and now the trend has been going that we were splitting up the roles. But
that is correct. That's something I touched on briefly in the book, I think. And actually, since I knew I was going to talk to you, I went and looked to see what the trend was now for splitting those roles. It is since he became CEO,
1992.
Right. It was significantly more than half of companies in the S&P 500 had the same individual as chair and CEO. 10 years later, the trend was away from that, about half. And now it's less than half here in the United States. However, from 2021 to 2022, it's edging back up. I just looked at the most recent data this morning. So it's about 47% in 2022, where the same person serves as CEO and chair. My personal take on that, having examined so many companies that have issues, I think it's a bad idea. I think that even from the individual's perspective, to have someone else as part of the process, the oversight, that, Kozlowski was just in general very big on moving quickly, didn't like meetings, didn't like having to take minutes, didn't like formalities. If he could make a decision talking to someone in the hallway, and I'm talking big decisions, he would rather do that. It's his style, which also kind of aligns with that. I don't like to deal with my personal bills and things like that. So he believed he needed to be both chair and CEO so that the company could move quickly when they wanted to. He could make a decision quickly. They could be efficient and effective. When he became CEO initially, for the first 6 months, there was a different person as the chair of the board. And it was actually the immediately prior CEO, which was, there was a lot of tension there between the two of them. And then after 6 months, the board decided that Kozlowski should be both the CEO and the chair. Of course, he was very happy about that decision. He felt like the company needed a single vision, that his style and his ideas did not align with the chairs. And so he, of course, he felt it would be easier for him. Plus, in this case, not only, not having a chairperson other than yourself, the rest of the board was really hands off, so they really let him do what he wanted. And the longer he was in that role, the more that was true. So not only did he not have another person as the chair, he had a really hands-off board altogether. So that's tough. I'm surprised that it hasn't come up here more, where you would. And looking back, there are so many of these things. Looking back, I've said to him, if you'd have had someone else chairing the board besides you, maybe this all wouldn't have fallen on you. You were easy target at that point because it's all you. If there had been somebody else in the decision-making process and in the governance and the oversight, would not have been as easy for it all to land on you. And maybe he needed someone to tell him no. Not maybe. He certainly did. He needed someone with a different management style to temper, the things that ultimately became problematic for him. So, while in the short term, it feels good to have less hurdles, in the long term, it could be quite an issue.
Splitting the responsibilities and recording every decision are clearly two great lessons from this story.
Yes.
And in the book you also write, and as we touched upon earlier, how the media attacked Kozlowski, and among many things they called him greedy, a pig, a thief, and they played a really big role in this story. What's your view on that?
Well, as I first became aware of the Tyco scandal, those are all the things I saw and heard and read. The media likes sensationalism. Those things are easy to understand and draw attention. If you look at any articles written about him, and there's still many written regularly, even today, they cannot mention his name without talking about the $6,000 shower curtain and the big birthday party that he threw for his wife at the time. Though neither of those two issues were part of the charges that for which he was convicted, but they're sensational facts that the media always grasps onto, which I get it. I get how the media needs viewers and readers, and those things bring people's attention to the story. What I found more disturbing with the media, once I really started diving into the case and had access to the actual corporate documents, evidence presented at trial, testimony under oath, was how completely inaccurate much of the reporting was. That I did not expect. I have read financial media, newspapers, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times for decades. And I always placed the highest regard for truth and accuracy in those, in those types of sources. Now, right now, there's so much information available. Being able to weigh, evaluate how much of it is accurate. I mean, that's tough for all of us, especially with social media and so many sources of news. But there are still, those old sources that you like to think you can believe when they put something in their outlet. But I found just factually inaccurate story, just factually inaccurate. Even in textbooks that I use, it's just like, that's not true. Like I'm actually holding the document, the evidence presented in trial. I'm holding it in my hand, and that's not correct. Those things did surprise me. I also think that he really, just timing wise, it just hit the peak of public's disgust with corporate leadership, with all of the big scandals, tens of thousands, that's an underestimate, of people lost significant amounts of money in these scandals. Not Tyco necessarily, but, Enron and WorldCom and some of the others. And so it was an easy time to create the bad guy in the media. And it was easy to do that to him. He had made a lot of money, one of the highest paid, if not the highest paid CEO during those years. He spent a lot of money very publicly, which makes him easy to target. His trial took place at the height of, these scandals. I think the Martha Stewart trial was happening very close time-wise to his, and she had the same issue with a lot of negative media coverage. So it was, I think it was tough for him. Still so much negative coverage of him in the media. But it, I guess the most disturbing thing for me is a lack of accurate information. Again, I always go back. The lawyer in me is always looking for people to be accurate, And, if we look at this from investors' point of view, it's like, where do you get good information? We have to depend on the media for, as a watchdog. Certainly we want the media to dive into these stories and to, report things that seem off, and, but if it's not done accurately, that doesn't help either. We know that some bad reporting can destroy careers, and it can certainly have an impact on stock value, accurate or not. So I think that the media has a huge responsibility. I know I always feel like I'm always swaying away from business ethics into journalistic ethics. It's like, come on, you got to get it right. You have a lot of power, both for positively and negatively.
Niklas and I prefer books to other type of media and news articles and so on. It's usually
Agreed.
of higher quality, but of course you need to be critical to the facts there as well. But as we mentioned, I mean, the company numbers, that's another source of information that we really need to trust. And when it comes to these kind of situations that we have been through here, I mean, we put a lot of trust in the people, the operators, and of course also the auditors, that they ensure that the numbers are correct. And as shareholders, it's hard to get the kind of information that you have digged up in the Kozlowski case. I mean, these kind of corporate governance troubles inside the company. But besides what we have talked about so far, can you mention a few other red flags that you think investors should look out for when it comes to corporate governance?
Well, I can. I don't know that in Tyco that you would have seen it. They had PwC was their auditor. That I don't know that you get any more respected auditor than that. And they certainly didn't report any issues with their financial reporting. So red flags, when I think about as a whole, all the companies that have gotten tied up in financial fraud, one thing that always sticks out to me is if you look at the financial statements and you don't understand how they're making their money or how they're reporting it. And Enron's the big example of that. It's like, I can still read I've read about Enron for decades at this point. And I read some of it and I still don't understand, like, what's the revenue? What's the source of revenue? I think if something is, if you can generally look at a financial statement and know what it means and where the numbers come from, and you look at a company's financial statements and you can't make sense of it, I think that's a big red flag. I think that's and Enron's certainly not the only company to do that. If your financial statements just leave users confused, that's a red flag.
One thing I was thinking about was you mentioned, for example, the fee that Kozlowski paid to the director, which was actually in the proxy statement. Yes. So, I mean, one thinking I had was that, I mean, you need to read the proxy, because even though that's not a criminal act, or, I mean, I still find it like
eyebrows, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
it's too much money that's just thrown away from the company, I think. So, I mean, for me, that was a red flag, even though it's not illegal, so to speak.
Agree. Yes.
It was not that big of a sum when you compared it in the book to how much they paid to the other investment bankers. I think it was Goldman and Lehman. I mean,
right.
It was a very small amount, but it still raises some eyebrows, and you can question the company, of course.
Well, and certainly because the person receiving it sits on the board of directors, like that's
exactly.
That is different than paying the other investment bankers. Yes, and that was their argument. That's Kozlowski's argument, is that is a small fee based on the size of the transaction. That was the that's the counter argument there. But yes, things like that, things like but you're right. The average investor just doesn't have access to that kind of information. I didn't have access to it until I started writing a book after there were criminal trials, when evidence is produced in trials. Like a lot of that information is just never going to be available until somebody's in trouble. And that's too late, because gosh, 80% of the information in the book is information I only had access to because there were criminal trials. Beyond that, no one would have ever gathered up that information, or certainly I would have never had access to it, or an investor would never have had access to it. But you're right. Read the details. And we even count on people to do that too. We count on an analyst to know that, and I know that, but that there should be, yes, red flags. Somebody's eyebrows should be raised, saying, that doesn't seem right to me.
I mean, for me, I can also say that, I mean, I'm an equity analyst and a private investor, and for me, it's more or less that I try to avoid investing in large companies because it's messy. I mean, it's so much material that you need to read and understand, and yeah, it's so much work. So it's often easier in smaller companies which have much more simple financial statements, and annual reports are much shorter and so on.
Also easier to get access to management if you have questions.
In the bigger the company, the more complex everything is, and the easier to hide things. Like you can mask a lot of information just because of the sheer volume of it. And I think that is a commonality among big corporations that have had problems, is that you can, you just mask it with volume. Yeah. And digging out the little details. Right. You talk about that $20 million payment. Well, that's one tiny little line buried amongst, thousands of pages of information. And who's got the time to sift through it that thoroughly? That's a problem. And that's also the issue, when this ultimately went to trial, one of the big, I thought one of the strongest points in favor of the defendants was none of this was hidden. Everything that you're using against me was reported in the books and records of the company, audited, signed off on, so we weren't hiding anything. We weren't trying to secretly take bonuses. They're right there in the financial reports. In fact, the bonuses were, they provide a management representation letter annually to PwC. And they specifically said, be sure to, here are the bonuses we received. So they're even pointing them out to the auditors. That's, and again, it just makes you wonder, like, are even the auditors paying enough attention because there's so much, there's so much there.
Something which you mentioned now, and I also thought about it when I read the book, is that Tyco grew very fast, and this can be challenging in terms of building up bureaucracy and so on. And as you said, Kozlowski was not a fan of bureaucracy. He wanted to make really quick decisions and on the fly. And I mean, as an investor, you typically want to have companies that stay really, agile, even when they grow big. But maybe, if you can describe from an ethical perspective, what do you think are the most important aspects for companies to ensure when they scale up like this?
The top of my list, just based on this close look at Tyco and their rapid growth, one thing I know that they could have done better, that could have prevented all of the problems, is that they didn't hire the right people to manage the growth. Everyone who worked there, and Kozlowski was very proud of this, that in Tyco corporate operations, the same people worked there the entire time he was CEO. Nobody left at all. And I get that. I get where you would think that's a great thing because you've provided a place where people want to work and spend their careers. But it also raises the issue that none of those people had any experience running a company that large, including Kozlowski and Schwartz. They had no experience running a company that large. And I think that is a big reason for the sloppiness, the failure to recognize corporate formalities, to comply with those. I think if they had hired individuals who had experience at types of companies that were the size that Tyco had grown to, they would immediately come in and say, whoa, 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 this is a mess. We need to tighten up. We need to, here are the things that need to be done. And that just never happened. It was the same people who had been there all along, none of whom had experience running a company that large or that complex. So that's at the top of my list. I think making sure that you've got the right people in place. And another issue was, I mentioned, like, all of the same people stayed for all of those years. I believe, just as a general statement, that almost everyone in Tyco corporate operations was vastly overpaid. I think that, and do I think that's just Kozlowski's style in wanting to include everyone in this success? But it also, as someone who teaches business ethics, it also makes you think, well, were you paying people to do things that maybe they wouldn't have done otherwise, or to not say something or to not challenge things? I think there's a danger with overpaying people. And I'm not saying that anyone here in particular, I never found any evidence of anyone doing anything wrong because of their pay, but I certainly believe that the level of pay explains why no one left, because there's no, like, just as an example, the head of human resources made over $6 million a year for multiple years. I just think that's off the charts a high pay for a head of human resources. I don't think that person could leave Tyco and replace that salary. So I look at that and unfortunately for Kozlowski, she would have been the person who should have taken the bonuses to the board and didn't do it. So, Kozlowski is a very big pay for performance manager. That's how he believes people are motivated. They have the opportunity to make more money. The better their performance, the better the company performs. And he lived by that, not just for himself, but for all the people at Tyco. So with the growth, with the 10 years of significant growth, they were all making a lot of money. So, and this falls into that. I mentioned earlier how the compensation policies seemed off because of the company had grown so much. This is part of that problem too. There was just no one ever suggested review of policies of compensation. Are we where the market is on this? They were just, I think that as good stewards of the company, someone should have been suggesting review and revision of policies and compensation plans, because they seem to be out of whack.
I think this is a very good point, and a question that we think of often is, do you love the work or do you love the money? And this really comes back to that. And one way that we are at Redeye are working with this from an analyst perspective and an investor perspective, working with corporate governance, that is that we have a checklist, and then we have divided into 3 categories. So it's business, people, and financials. And the people aspect is what we are mostly touching upon here. And for example, as you mentioned, if the board's refreshment rate is very low, we will give a lower rating to that, because they are the same people and they're not getting any new blood into the boardroom. And then another point of that is, of course, remuneration. How much are they paid, and how is that relative to other companies? So I think that could be one way to assess that.
Yes. No one was having those conversations at Tyco, I can tell you.
No analyst covering it either, I guess.
Well, correct. Yes. You look at how many people missed it. Yeah. I mean, there should have been red flags that somebody caught along the way. Well, there were a couple. There were a couple people who spoke up and thought that, some of their accounting was a little off.
Some short sellers, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But that's really about it. The SEC investigated them a couple of times. They'd never come up with anything material. So, PwC audits, so it's, from an investor's perspective, you say, how would I know this is about to happen? How would I know?
Exactly. And I mean, we have been speaking about Enron and other scandals as well following the dot-com bubble. And I mean, there have been numerous new frauds as well, like Wirecard and most recently, it seems like FTX. And as a professor of business ethics, if you could wave your magic wand and change one thing in the corporate world to protect shareholders and the society, what would that be?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question. I've never had a magic wand. I really am reluctant to suggest government oversight regulations, because I know there are so many, and I know they're expensive for corporations. But I would probably start there. I would change the whole audit structure. Honestly, that's where I would start. I think there's such, and this played out, I think in all of these cases to some degree, you hire a CPA firm, you're required to, go through the steps of an independent audit. I think that is a stretch calling it independent, because the company hires these firms, they pay them tens of millions of dollars annually for their services. And then the firms are supposed to come in and say, oh, hey, we think this is off or this is wrong, and what's the instinct then of the company? Well, we're never going to hire them again. That there's such an inherent conflict there. And we can look back at those big scandals and see that the accounting profession failed us in those cases. They should, certainly Enron, WorldCom, there were things that should have been caught that were not.
And for Enron, even the firm actually got, killed by that.
Right, exactly. Yes, Arthur Andersen paid the ultimate price for that. Yeah. But you look at this and you think, maybe the whole independent audit scheme should be set up differently, where it is a government agency or a quasi-government agency, or certainly it's not the firm that you are hiring doesn't get paid by the company that they're then trying to determine if things are good or bad. They want to keep the business. That's the problem there. So I would probably start there. I just think based on what happened and the number of companies that have released clearly extremely fraudulent information, even after it's been audited, it shows that there's a problem with that system. And I still have great respect for accounting firms. I'm in the accounting department here at my university, so I very much respect the accounting profession, but I do think that there is a lot of risk in the current setup here in the U.S. for independent audits. I also would consider expanding the scope of audits, beyond just the limited financial information. Maybe have them delve deeper in, have access to the information like I had when I was writing this book. They might be the ones who should have access to everything, and we can use them to review everything for us. That's probably where I start with my magic wand.
Yeah, it makes me think of the credit rating agencies and the 2008 crisis that was kind of related in that sense.
Yes.
And there's a German proverb, whose bread I eat, his song I sing, which fits quite nicely.
That is correct. That's exactly what I'm saying. That is correct. That's it.
And to wrap up the Tyco story, have you stayed in touch with Dennis Kozlowski since the book was published in 2014, and where is he today?
I do hear from him or keep up with him occasionally. He lives, I believe, right now in Nantucket, I think. He remarried since he got out of prison. And I think he spends a lot of time with his wife, and he's got 2 daughters, and they have children. So I think that's where he concentrates his time. I think he does some consulting very quietly. and I think that, quite honestly, one thing I will say about him personally is that he's certainly resilient, both when I met him in prison and since he's gotten out. He's certainly never let it, of course I didn't know him before, so it's hard, I can't really compare to who he was before he went to prison, but in prison, I don't know how I would be, or I hope I never know how I would be in prison, but he was always upbeat and hopeful. And he was in prison for 8 1/3 years in a hardcore state prison, which is not an easy place to be. He has really, and since he's been out, he seems to have just put it behind him, which, I know that that's not always the case, but he seems good.
And as I have talked to people about taking down the lie in your book, ahead of this recording, several have said that it sounds like a really great movie. And I agree, it would be. Has that ever been on the table?
I agree. I just don't know how to make that happen.
Maybe some of our listeners.
Maybe someone can fill me in. I agree. And, and I've seen some of the other, films that have been made, about the Theranos and about Madoff, and, they are. And this is it's such an interesting story. Just the business stuff, the personal stuff, things that have always struck me as so interesting is how do you go from making $150 million a year and living the most luxurious life that you can imagine to, in a very short amount of time, living in a awful state prison with violent offenders. I just don't even know how you make that shift psychologically. I don't know. I just think those things are fascinating. I think that's, I think that, I think it would be a great movie. I wish I knew how to make that happen. Here in Cincinnati, I don't have a lot of Hollywood ties or anything. So
perhaps Bethany McLean has some contacts after Smartest Guys in the Room.
Maybe so. I spoke to her a couple of times when I was writing the book. She was helpful for me. Yeah.
That's good. And also in the book, you state that writing, it was the most all-consuming project you've ever undertaken. So we have to ask if you're considering writing any other book.
I would love to write another book. I just haven't, in order to invest the time and energy that it takes to put that together, you have to really be interested in the story. It has to be something that really draws you in. I just haven't found that next story yet. I'm on the lookout for it. So I hope to get into that. I've actually been, for the past 4 years here at my university, been working in an administrative role, chairing my department. So that kind of has taken me away from the things that I love to do. But I finished that, and I'm back ready to do some writing again. So hopefully I'll land on something that is just as interesting. I really feel like I should write another book, just because the learning curve was so big on the first one that I should take advantage of it.
Well, next year will be the 10-year anniversary from the last book, so that could be Could be one reason.
That's a good motivator, right? Yes, I've recovered maybe since then. So yeah, I honestly, rookie mistake. I agreed to a very, very short deadline on the first one, so I was really in a crunch to get it wrapped up. So
that's when you learn the most. But
that's right. Yes.
And for those who want to learn more about what to avoid and also what to look for when it comes to corporate governance, do you have some other book recommendations?
Well, the one that's on my list, ready to be read, is it's called Madoff Talks by a guy named Jim Campbell. I don't know if you've read it. I haven't read it yet, but that's the next one on my list. I think it's going to be very good. So that's the one I'm looking at next. So it's laying on my nightstand waiting for me. So
perfect. Thank you for that recommendation. And thank you also for a very interesting conversation about you and your book, Taking Down the Lion, which we really recommend everyone to buy and review. Do you have something more you want to add before we finish up here?
No, I just appreciate so much talking about the book. I love talking about it. I think it's a incredibly interesting story. And, I went into this whole thing just trying to figure out what we can learn from it. That's my perspective in that I'm talking to students every day. So that's how I approached it. And I found there was a lot to learn there, a lot.
Great. And lastly, where can our audience follow you and your work?
You can follow me. I am on Instagram. You can follow me on I have a website for the book, Taking Down the Lion. You can find it there. I think if you just Google Taking Down the Lion, you will find me. I'm at Northern Kentucky University, so you can always find me there as well.
Perfect. I hope to pay a visit sometime.
Yes, I hope you do too.
We're going to Omaha this year, so at least we're going to the US. So.
Oh, are you going to go see Warren Buffett?
Yes. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Investing by the Books, a podcast by Redeye. Follow us on Twitter at IB_Redeye and email us at ib.podcast@redeye.se. To improve, we'd love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review us. Notice that the content in this podcast is not and shall not be construed as investment advice. This information is meant to be informative and for general purposes only. For full disclaimer, visit redeye.se. I'm your host, Eddie Palmian, and until next time, I sincerely wish you the best of luck on your journey through life and investing.